Hello and welcome to a Spectator discussion on one of the most important, perhaps the most important topic in Britain today. What has just happened to our children's education? How deep is the damage and how can we repair it? We're also going to be looking at the role that online learning can play in making up the lost ground. And I'd like to thank our sponsor, EVERFI, which is an education company offering courses in things like financial and digital literacy, health and well-being. We're going to be hearing from some of the most articulate and influential voices in this debate. From Robert Halfon, Tory MP and Chair of the Education Select Committee, from Anne Longfield, who only last month stepped down as Children's Commissioner, from Adrian Packer, who's Education Principal with Core Education Trust, which sponsors academy schools under its own distinctive learning style, and finally Martin Finn, who heads up Global Operations at EVERFI UK. And now we're going to be taking opening remarks from our panelists. I'll be asking them questions, but importantly, we're going to be taking questions from you watching this. Now, you can submit questions by writing in the text box of our website, or if you want to be old school, you can email events@spectator.co.uk. There is so much to discuss, so many questions to ask, so do please fire in the questions whenever they strike you. You'll be able to watch this whole panel again by pressing replay after the event. So first, some opening comments. And Robert, let's start with you.
Thank you, and it's really great to be doing this Spectator platform. Thank you for all you do for education. I just want to pose the question, what does online learning actually mean? We've seen the Oak National Academy, BBC Bite Size, the National Tutoring Programme, Google Classroom, the Invicta National Academy. But to be clear, all these things are absolutely welcome. I worry that we are focusing too much on inputs as opposed to outcomes. I think that a lot of the chatter and talk about online learning has a bit been like the old tractor production in the Soviet Union has gone up by X%, but whether or not the people had any grain is a different story. And we've asked questions like how many children don't have laptops, how many don't have Wi-Fi, how many laptops have the DFE delivered, what about 4G routers, how many views has the Oak National Academy got, and all these things are important, but online learning can't be an argument about the numbers going into the machine, because even if the government doled out millions of devices, even if the Oak Academy went viral, do we know they're making a difference? What impact are they having? Do we know if the children have the motivation to switch them on and concentrate without the usual support networks available in school? And we don't. And so we should be looking at online learning in terms of outcomes. And there doesn't seem to be enough being asked, in my view, as to the actual impact these initiatives are having on children's attainment. In my view, every child having gone back to school should be assessed by the government to look at with schools and the local authorities to look at how much lost learning there's been and how much catch up is needed. And there should be regular assessments given what has occurred as well. But we also need the right kind of online learning. So if technology is used to purely digitalize what would normally be done in the classroom, i.e. streaming an otherwise unmodified lesson or submitting homework through virtual learning environments rather than in person, then we can't expect great leaps in terms of efficiently recovering lost learning, although we might save a fair whack of paper. We need to be efficient with catch up, because if we do move at a glacial pace, we'll allow the pandemic to have a ricochet effect, damaging the life chances of the COVID generation year after year. And if children don't catch up quickly, they'll struggle to keep pace as they progress to the next academic year, key stage for college and university. And we know that the pace of catch up will be different for each pupil due to different experiences in lockdown. And Ofsted have highlighted just how children's knowledge base and soft skills have declined. Ofsted saying children have been disoriented, anxious, less confident with others, slower to join in with activities. NFER EEF study in autumn found year 2 pupils were 2 months behind in English and maths compared to pupils in previous years. And the department's own study of the autumn term suggested that schools with high levels of disadvantage have experienced higher levels of loss than other schools, particularly at secondary level. We also know BC, before coronavirus, that disadvantaged pupils were 18 months plus behind their better off peers by the time they sat their GCSEs. And that hasn't altered despite all the government reforms for 5 years. And in 2019, nearly a quarter of all vacancies were skills shortage vacancies, an increase of 2 percentage points on 2017. And 9 million adults in England have low literacy or numeracy skills. So the mammoth task of recovery demands a much more sophisticated approach. And this is where we can really harness advances in technology through the use of AI, artificial intelligence, to tailor learning. I know there are many AI skeptics who see it as snake oil, but if we always remain stuck in the past, refusing to look at any advances in technology, we'd still have the team train instead of the bullet train, the A to Z rather than Google Maps, and the penny farthing instead of the Peloton bike. And as the Central Tech founder and winner of the Spectator's National Innovator of the Year Award, Priya Lakhani, notes in her 2020 book, Inadequate, he says, the delivery of education has not fundamentally changed since the Industrial Revolution. We've gone from a blackboard to an interactive whiteboard and not much further. I was struck recently when a Princess Trust young ambassador told me she was a kinesthetic learner. I regret to say that I wasn't aware if I was inter or intrapersonal learner, if I learned best auditorily, spatially, or verbally, or a mixture of all these, but I'm not sure I'm alone in that. AI online learning can learn how each child absorbs information best and tailor the content, optimize learning for that individual. It's like having a 24/7 personal tutor on your desk. And to be clear, this is not an attack on standards. AI can work alongside a strong focus on academic excellence and zero tolerance approach to poor behavior. The remarkable Michaela School, as I understand it, has harnessed technology to monitor the effort students put into their assignment while schools were closed. So this is where I go back to the central question. Can online learning help recover what children lost during the pandemic? I really believe that the best kind of learning takes place inside school gates, because the home environment doesn't lend itself to focused learning, laptop or no laptop. The NHS has a 10-year plan. Why can't education have a long-term plan? And the pandemic's thrown up all kinds of questions about our education system. Should we alter term times, extend the school day, change the curriculum, scrap GCSEs, replace A-levels with an international baccalaureate at 18? My favourite option is to extend the school day, supported by civil society groups, to provide extracurricular sports, mental health and academic catch-up where needed. Now, extended hours in EdTech should be debated, and it's something the Education Recovery SAR could be considered, particularly as we march headlong into the fourth industrial revolution. PwC suggests that 28% of jobs done by young people are at risk of automation or AI. And understanding the potential disruption that the rise of artificial intelligence and automation will cause is crucial to establishing how our education system should respond. And that's why I believe we should establish, if possible, a short and snappy Royal Commission on Artificial Intelligence, made up of the finest practitioners, but also experts in AI, data and learning, economics and education, to understand the impact that AI is going to have and inform a national long-term plan for education. So in conclusion, we need to know what we're talking about when we say online learning. We must do much more to focus on outcomes rather than inputs. We need the right kind of catch-up and be efficient with our recovery efforts so as not to damage the COVID generation for years to come. It means harnessing AI as a personal tutor on your desk. Online learning should take place in school, and it must form part of a national long-term plan for education, which may involve reimagining our whole education system and assessment. And we must understand the impact of the fourth industrial revolution and adapt our education system to meet those challenges. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Robert. Lots of food for thought there. And now I'd like to go to Anne Longfield. Anne has been Children's Commissioner for many years, and way before it was fashionable to do so, she was campaigning, almost as soon as lockdown started, to flag up the problems that the absence of classroom learning would create. So she spent the last year, or for many years, as Children's Commissioner campaigning for education. And over to you.
Thank you, and thank you for inviting me to this event. And I think, we have spent, many of us on the screen, Robert, especially the last year, arguing that schools are a good thing, which is something I never imagined that I would have to do. This notion that actually kids should be in school and school had benefits, and actually benefits beyond the classroom, was something which I think this year has taught us. But I also think it's been a year where there's been that kind of really sharp spotlight onto what the experience of going to school and education is for kids. And of course, like every other aspect of their lives, we now know, if we didn't before, that it's very varied. The difference for the kids over the last year that have been in, comfortable houses with parents that are working at home, with those that have been in cramped accommodation, sometimes with parents who needed to go to work, has also been reflected in their experience of school. You've had some kids that would be largely going to private schools that have continued almost from day one with a full classroom online, logging into each classroom, working throughout the day. And certainly for the first lockdown, there were a huge amount of children that didn't have access to either the tech or indeed the broadband. And there's an estimate of about 1 million children, somewhat more than that possibly, who haven't had tech for large parts of this, or haven't have it in the household. And when we talk about online learning, and I think I agree completely with what Robert just said then about online learning, but also for online learning for a lot of kids, certainly at the beginning of lockdown, was a phone. And sometimes it was a borrowed phone from a parent, and sometimes it was a broken phone with a cracked screen. So this notion that actually, the fact that children are working online, even if they can get on, isn't always what we think about in terms of that kind of, really intense study that we want children to be able to do, or even intense experience. So I think we know an awful lot at the end of this year, more than we did at the beginning. But also we do know that digital has taken on a new centrality in terms of children's learning. And over the years, I was Children's Commissioner, I was struck really early on how kids told me that actually, in their minds, the digital world was just part of life. It wasn't this thing that you dialed up like some of us remember doing. They couldn't see where the different parts of their life started and ended. And I think there's something there that wasn't the case 10 years ago, that is the case now, which does demand that we look again at how we can use the online experience in a whole range of things, including education. I think it's really important that we look at what the place schools are in terms of their own tech. And we know again that the experience in private schools, about 60% of them already set and had education online, compared to about a quarter of state schools, slightly more state schools in affluent areas, about a third of them. But the starting point for a lot of schools was hugely varied. In some schools, they were used to setting homework online. Many others weren't. And a lot of the connection with more vulnerable communities over the first few weeks and months was really about keeping in touch, in a physical way, visiting the house, handing out papers and packs, almost something which is for most people several decades out of date. But I think there is a moment now where we can really revolutionize the role of schools and in digital education. But I think we're going to have to want to do it. I would love to see schools being really brought up to have the best tech possible in terms of children's learning, but also to look at how schools can become digital hubs for that wider community. We know there's lots of ambitions around broadband that government have. Well, let's start with schools. Let's look at how we can make schools at the forefront of the digital revolution, including first and foremost with education. I think the gains for that with children are enormous. gains in terms of enrichment and in terms of supporting their wider education, gains in terms of their particular interests or even needs. We know that actually mental health support online has been something that kids really took to during the last year. We didn't know whether they would, but actually most do. But also in terms of getting kids ready to work and really ensuring that those children who we know need the greatest resilience in terms of any economic downturn or recession that's coming have the work skills that they need. Something I think we often take for granted, but something if you've been using digital, you're way ahead of more than others. The two things that, and slightly reflecting what Robert said, the two things I'd really like to just make us a little bit more wary of. First of all, about 40% of the lowest income households said they didn't have desk space for their kids to learn at the beginning of lockdown. So again, you know, we can make as much available digitally and give as much tech out as we want, but children live within households and we should be aware of what that means. In the past, there was a big push to open schools for actually homework at various points. I'd say I'd want social activities as well, but you know, we need to understand that that's not always the case. And then the other is about just personal interaction. I saw what happened in some universities around going onto a digital basis, whereas kids often lost that interaction or could lose that interaction with their tutors, with that relationship. And I think it's very easy for some kids to fall out of that. But I am an optimist with this. I do think there is a potential here. And I think that's something now in terms of the wider debate about not only build back, but also getting ahead and levelling up. This really does have a place.
And thanks very much for that. Now I'd like to turn to Adrian. And Adrian, perhaps you could just say a little bit about CORE and what it does, but then tell us about your remarks.
Yeah, so we're a multi-academy trust. We sponsor schools, but we specialise in looking after schools that have had some difficulties and challenges, particularly reputationally when things have gone wrong. So we put things right. So we're very used to dealing with complex situations, not quite at this level, but we're certainly adept at crisis management, and we have a very outward-facing approach. And we work in partnership with sports, physical activity, and arts organisations to enrich the experience that we give our children in the schools that we sponsor. So, does that answer your question on?
Yeah, yes, absolutely. No, just because, you know, quite often it is easier for schools with very affluent, very rich families back at home to adopt to online learning. I just wanted to say before your remarks that the people you're dealing with are the ones at the sharp end of the problems we've just been discussing. Absolutely.
And they are not hard to reach. And this is something I'm always emphasizing. We use that expression far too easily, that these children are hard to reach. And actually, to Robert's point, it's easier than we thought to distribute laptops. That's the easy bit. It's what happens once those laptops are in the homes of the families we're looking after. And that does require a lot more thought. I think we've just focused on coverage, on the idea of distribution of equipment. That scratches the surface of the real issues. But also it loses sight of the potential of technology. COVID didn't invent technology in schools. We were using technology before the pandemic, and of course we were using it afterwards. What it's done is it's focused our minds on the potential of technology. But I think as a frontline practitioner, I one thing I want to do is to encourage us to stop using defeatist language of gaps and general left behindedness, which does affect the children we look after, but that's not what they want to hear. That's not what they need to hear. I think we need to shift the debate for all schools, but particularly for in my context, we need to talk about acceleration. We need to think about potential of this reimagined future that we're all talking about. But I think we should be talking about that future as a period of restoration, and that should give us real hope for the future. So just briefly on to take an analog perspective for a moment on acceleration, yes, to shorter holidays and to longer school days, absolutely yes. 39% of English community sports facilities are behind school gates, so let's get them open and often and now. I want us to have a real focus on sport, physical activity, and the arts. I think we used to call it youth services, but I think as part of this reboot, I don't want these really important endeavours to get lost within the discussion and debate around technology. And I also think we shouldn't be expecting teachers to fix everything. We might open the schools, but they don't need to be there to deliver every aspect of provision in an extended day. So we know there are thousands of external qualified providers, and they're out there ready to get back to work and to offer a decent supplementary provision. And then on potential, and this has been touched on by everybody, it's really thinking of schools as places of congregation and safety. And that's what we found with our vulnerable children. They have certainly become more vulnerable. Our at-risk children have certainly become more at risk. So we know, and we should absolutely celebrate, the schools provide a canvas to be safe and to learn about themselves and others. And let's face it, we should be talking about what we've all missed most, and that's just being with each other. So I think this idea of congregation is really important. So being online together is one thing, but being physically together is another. And we must not lose sight of that. And that's not just the classroom, by the way. That's the playground, the school hall, and the corridors. So I really love the story of Paul McCartney meeting George Harrison on the school bus. On the school bus. And it's fascinating when you think, but they didn't actually do brilliantly in their music lessons. In fact, they did pretty badly. And they were probably just too busy dreaming of a day when they'd meet John, who went to the college next door. But school for them was a place to meet and to dream. And I don't think we should ever apologize for that. So on restoration, and this is perhaps where the technology comes in, I think, and everyone's already kind of touched on this idea of the what next, the debate about what next, and that being a long-term what next. Please, a long-term what next. I don't want us to put all our academic catch-up eggs in one basket. I think we should look at this necessary innovation through adversity to become plain and simple reform, which will allow us to look forward with a high degree of optimism. So I want us to be bold. That's my view as a frontline practitioner. And I do want to look at the purpose and function of external exams. And I do want to look at the richness of technology as well as, not instead of. And they might be seen as hot potatoes. I don't know those two issues of exams and technology. But there is no doubt, of course, they've been thrust upon us as a result of the pandemic. But my feeling is this: what if we looked back and realized we'd actually stumbled upon a long-term solution of greatness? That's what I'm hoping for. The future isn't cancelled. In fact, it might actually end up looking better than we could ever have imagined by it being reimagined, I suppose. Yeah. And I know you may say I'm a dreamer, but you know the rest.
Well, let's see if you are the only one, Adrian. Martin, Finn, we've heard a lot of very interesting perspectives there about the potential of tech, about the limitations of online learning, about whether we might have stumbled across a magic solution. So please, let's have your perspective on what we've learned and what we've yet to learn from the last year.
Okay, so thanks, Fraser. Look, first, I just want to explain a little bit about what we do at EVERFI, because it very much sort of informs what I'm going to say. So we use education and technology to address a range of social challenges in the UK and globally. And we do this by delivering teaching and learning programs to schools on behalf of businesses, government and charities. And we help them engage with schools and young people and bring their expertise and those real world examples into the classroom learning. So a kind of shorthand is that we bring business and education together. So there were 3 points that I was going to make in relation to this. And the first is really about that learning gap. Adrian, apologies for using that word, but the learning gap. And I think that we must look at that gap beyond just academic terms and about providing that rounded education for all young people, because what we've seen at EVERFI, interestingly, has been asked of us most during this pandemic is about topics such as work-related learning and health and wellness and entrepreneurship. And I think also that the array of issues that we've seen arisen from the pandemic, and the biggest one of those is mental health, but also about those development of social skills and about that ability to work together, about development of language. And I know others have mentioned other things, that they've highlighted just how much schools deliver way beyond the core academic understanding. And I think a really important point is that all of those issues have affected disadvantaged children disproportionately in the pandemic, so that they've got even further to catch up than some of their more advantaged peers. So I think we've got a gap on top of a gap. So my second point is about what role technology can play in this. And I think we've just had the largest experiment in the use of educational technology that we have ever seen. And one of the things is I hope that there is going to be a huge data gathering activity to pull together the learning from that, to find out what's worked and what's worked for some children and why it hasn't worked for others, and what we need to take forward going forward. But the evidence points to the fact that the teachers, what they're saying is that they're going to use that technology much more in their teaching in future. And by this, we're talking about teaching and learning technology, not about the Zooms and the Teams. And also that students want to learn using that technology more in future. But if we're going to do that, and if we're going to close that gap equitably, and Robert, I take all your points about we need to focus on outcomes, but I think we need to ensure that all students have access to a computer at home, because some of that learning is still going to be happening at home. And we're talking about computers, not about one mobile or one device between a large family. I think that they need a computer to access that, or they're going to be disadvantaged. But I think what the pandemic has also shown us is about, I think it's reasserted the primacy of the role of the teacher. And what teachers schools have told us is just about what students want is that time with their teachers. And it's just about how important that teacher-student relationship is. So what technology can do to help with that is that it can free up the teacher to focus on that pupil support, focus on those relationships and that teaching, that face-to-face teaching, but leave some of that where technology can deliver some of that subject matter teaching. And if it's right, it should be directed by the teacher, it should be evidence-based, and ideally it should be feeding back to the teacher so that they know what progress the pupils are making. And that's where I think technology can really score in helping to address this issue, certainly in that shorter term. And the final point I want to make is about just I think the monumental task that schools have got, and it's one that's going to last for years. And I think that they can't do it alone. And so while there are all sorts of other outside providers, I think it's also time that businesses who aren't engaged with school and education, that wherever possible, they need to come forward and see what they can offer. And they can help in sort of so many ways, whether they're small or large, and particularly around, I think, the non-core learning with things like work experience, around financial literacy, careers awareness, and health and well-being. And I think all of these things, we would say that all children should have access to them, but also that disadvantaged children will have the least access to those without that support from other organizations, including businesses. And that's why I think now is the time that some of those businesses need to step forward if they can. So I think those are the 3 points that I would make as sort of opening remarks about the issue.
Martin, thanks very much indeed. Now, I was going to do my questions, but we've had so many questions coming in from people watching this that I'll go straight into them. Just as a reminder, to ask a question, you can ask it either in the text box if you're watching this online, or by emailing events, plural, at spectator.co.uk. That's events@spectator.co.uk. Now, we've had 3 questions on the same theme to you, Robert Halfon, because in some parts of your opening remarks, you sounded quite pessimistic about the notion of what IT can do. Now, nobody, I think, would seriously dispute why the best learning takes place inside the classroom. But I guess that the question here is, if you want to do educational catch-up, for example, Robert, you've spoken about extending the school day. Now, you might get your way, but if you don't, then the only tool we'll have at our resources will be electronic tools. But you mentioned artificial intelligence. Can you say a bit more about what you mean by AI in the context of education? You seem to be optimistic about AI and contrast it with lower forms of online learning.
Yeah, well, first of all, I'm not pessimistic about online learning. I love technology. I absolutely think it has a central part to play, and absolutely every child who can't get access to a mobile phone or proper computer needs to have one. I see that in my constituency where families are using 1 3-year-old, 4-year-old phone, mobile phone for, to 4 or 5 people. And I also think the online learning experience has been very good for many students. You know, we've got the existing established national tutoring program. You've also got disruptors like the Invicta Academy that are doing a lot of good things. But what I was trying to say was that, first of all, I think a lot of focus has been about inputs, computers, how many hits websites have had, and we don't know yet which is the best product. And in terms of the catch-up, all the evidence shows, and I'm not necessarily talking about summer holidays here, because obviously you want the disadvantaged pupils to go, and the evidence suggests that actually disadvantaged pupils don't always go to summer school activities and so on. But all the evidence shows that I have seen that a longer school day with predominantly mental health activities, well-being, sporting activities, makes a huge difference to the educational attainment of children, both in terms of numeracy, general education attainment increasing by up to 2 months. So my focus, if I had the option of extended school day, would be to focus on predominantly sporting and mental health well-being, given what has occurred, but also possibly academic online catch-up at school. I want the children to be at school. So the points that Adrian made were quite remarkable and absolutely right, because the children go to school to socialise, to form networks. Some of them get fed because they don't get a proper meal at home. They get counselling, they get support if they come from very troubled families. We've got to get away from this idea that children can do everything at home. Of course, some can, and there are many great home educators, but we need our children back in school and doing those online activities in the school. In terms of the AI, what I'm talking about are the programs that you literally, the student will have a computer or a tablet on their desk, and whilst the teacher is teaching, it reflects the learning experience of those. What I've seen, it reflects the learning experience of that student and adapts in a way that the teacher is not always able to do, because obviously the teacher is teaching to a whole class of people with very different abilities. And the way I sum up AI is very simple. It's like having a super chess computer type personal tutor on your desk.
Well, Robert, if I can just interrupt you there. Are you saying that the devices you're talking about are actually asking the pupils questions? Or are they testing them throughout the lesson? How are they supposed to find out how well or otherwise the students learning?
Central Tech I mentioned, who won your award, are kind of some of the leaders in this, but there are many companies, and we need to look at what works. But they're doing a mixture. What I've seen, they do a mixture of everything. They ask the students questions, they adapt to their learning, they pick their learning mechanisms, which, you know, if a teacher is teaching 30, 35 people with different abilities, they're not always able to do that. And I think the potential could be very, very exciting if it's done properly, if it's tested, if the outcomes of the students are clear, because we have to make a distinction, as I say, between what I call the snake oil salesman and the genuine innovators who can really make a difference.
Right. Adrian, a question here from Nick Watson. He's asking if you mentioned that you can give kids computers, but it's whether they use them at home that is the difference or not. In other words, there'll be some kids sitting there with their mummy, even their nanny, who knows, standing over them saying, yeah, you're going to make sure you use this lesson. Then you're going to get other kids who don't have that parental attention, perhaps not out of neglect, but perhaps the mother is working or whatever. What can be done, if anything, to help those children? Because if you're relying on online learning, the question is, are you not fundamentally, there's not much you can do to reach out to a child you can't see because he's at home. So I guess in the next two questions, what can be done for the pupils you feel are falling behind in the way that you've outlined? And secondly, how do you know if they're falling behind?
The first thing is we've already answered the first question. It's get children back to school. Home is home. School is school. From my experience, it doesn't really matter what kind of home you're talking about. It's still not school. We need children in school. They are. Right. Let's hope they stay there. and let's promote all the ideas we've talked about already.
I should probably say, Adrian, that I don't think that for this discussion, you're right. Schools are back. Hopefully, they won't be disrupted. Again, everybody agrees that the classroom is best. The question is whether, when you're doing catch up, whether it be evenings, weekends, summer, or whatever, in that context, that's when online learning comes to the fore. And I guess the question here was, how can you tell if you are going to? I don't know if you have any plan to continue online learning when schools are back, but if you were to, how do you spot kids who are falling behind?
Okay, so this relates to the point I made earlier, which is we were using technology before the pandemic. We are used to using technology to enrich and complement in-person learning. This idea of going back to the defeatist language of falling behind, undoubtedly, disadvantaged children, all children have had a period where they will have fallen behind. I think how we measure this is quite complex, because we can look at academic data of how they're falling behind, but it's very difficult to measure how they're falling behind because they haven't had the opportunities for the kind of things I talked about, the physical interaction. And I think we will continue to learn about that over time. But on the idea that the extended day, the holidays and everything else, I have a slightly different experience to what Robert explained on the evidence that there wasn't a massive take up on summer holidays. We have incredible take up when we offer decent provision, and maybe that's the issue. It's decent provision. And I can relate that also back to technology, which is, I don't think any of us are talking here about technology for technology's sake. We're talking about using technology as a way to enrich the experience that we're giving our children and to make it more efficient. I love the point that Robert made. Let teachers focus on the business of teaching, and let's look at how other aspects of the job might be picked up through technology, through AI potentially. I've seen some really good examples of that. So this is looking at it holistically in the round of technology being part of a much bigger reimagining of what is possible. So I don't think we should get too hung up on the idea of how do we know how far behind children are. Of course, we know that's a problem, but we should be focusing on how do we accelerate opportunities for all children in as many different ways as possible, and technology is part of that.
Martin Finn, can I ask you to comment about AI as part of online learning? I'm not quite sure if that's a funny way of saying like online learning, which does more regular assessments of pupils' progress. Is this a growing part of the scene, of the industry, if you can call it that?
Yeah, I think it is a growing part of the scene, and I think there's a lot of technology out there that some which has been around for a while. I think there are sort of two issues really, I think, for me, about the shorter term and the longer term. And I think what Robert's talking about, for me, feels like more like the longer term. And I think that technology is only going to develop, and it's only going to get smarter. But even at the moment, I think there is a lot of evidence-based technology that is there. And where it's properly designed and it's well designed, it's looking at what the student does. It's giving students options so that they can direct some of their learning. It's gathering data as they go. It's allowing students to gather what they want to do as they go through that learning journey, and it's feeding back to the teacher. And I think if that is robust and if that is well designed and it's properly done, then that plays a huge role in terms of supporting the teacher to allow them to do some of that face-to-face work that Adrian's been talking about. That, and I'm not suggesting also that all of this learning should be happening at home. I think it's part of that school mix. But I think that the reality is that we have to understand where schools are in terms of their use of technology and where teachers are in terms of their confidence with the use of that technology. And they are at so many different stages, and that we need to build on what schools have learned during this pandemic. And we need to be gathering that, because we have such a sort of dispersed school system that there aren't those sort of obvious sources of that data gathering to find out actually what's worked and what hasn't. And then we need to apply that. But we also need that longer term plan, I think, that Robert was talking about, with those much more advanced technologies, and they need to be proved, I think, before that they can be properly introduced.
Right. And Longfield, a question for you. We're hearing about the new, or not exactly new, but now newly used potential of technology to identify who's falling behind and the kids who need extra help. A question from Nigel Minizimi. You've been Children's Commissioner for several years, you were for several years. Why has it taken a virus to make government think about what home internet provision can do for disadvantaged children?
Yeah, well, I mean, it has been quite a shock, I think, this last year on many, many fronts and different aspects of all our lives, but children as well. And some of these issues about the way children learn and the need for technology, I don't think have been at the forefront. It's been this year, I think, the fact that there was no alternative. Suddenly children weren't in school. You know, the number of days they've been out accounts for about 850 million in total. So a massive number of days that kids have been out. But I mean, certainly I, for one, have been arguing for what I call holiday play schemes. We call them summer schools, we call them whatever we want, and after school activities and actually before school activities since, well, from virtually the first month I actually gained employment. So, you know, some of these things come around, and seems to me that we need a logical solution here. It's not just suddenly about kids, you know, actually doing all their learning online at home. It's actually how they can combine this within their time now, hopefully in school for the long term. And I think that, you know, what we're talking about here is ways of making children want to learn. There's something, you know, children learn best when they want to. Children actually go to activities they want to go to. The draw's got to be in there for them to be able to do that and want to do that. So I think there is another interesting angle here, which is about how do we make how do we enrich the learning process and make it appealing for children who we're asking to do more of. And I would like more. I'd like more time in school. I'd like more extended days and holiday activities, very broad social activities, play, sport, arts and the like, and some learning with that too. But I'd also like them to be at the forefront of technology, because we all know what that can do with our lives. If we want to learn a language, we go online as adults. If we want to, you know, find out about a whole range of things, we go online. So I don't want children to miss out on this because it's too difficult to do in a mass system, which is quite disparate. And that, I think, is where we are at the moment with schools and tech at a very different place for different schools. That's something that I think that only government can step in to help boost, to ensure people get to the same place or a good place.
Okay, thank you, Anne. A question from James McPherson to Adrian. In your experience as a principal, he's asking, have you noticed any new computer products, any new digital learning things that made you think, maybe halfway through the pandemic, wow, this is quite good. I hadn't quite thought about the potential of this particular software as a learning tool. I guess the question is if you've seen this as a catalyst for innovation or a catalyst for teachers thinking about how online learning could help in perhaps in a way they wouldn't have before the pandemic.
No, I've been quite disappointed we haven't innovated more. I think we've lost the opportunity to this point. It's been very much that uses a mechanism to maintain a form of learning, and I think we've been in a kind of survival mode. I think what should happen next is we should start to look at technology in a thriving mode of innovation. I suppose that's what I'm saying, is this is a moment in time to really kickstart that innovation around looking at technology beyond a Teams lesson.
So what sort of things do you have in mind? I mean, when you're giving us the sort of the John Lennon optimistic scenario, could you give us, could you imagine, as it were, some sort of tech which might help you in your dream scenario?
Yeah, I've seen some examples of the AI. I've not seen it in a school's context, and I think it's that next step, that next leap towards what does it actually look like that we need to encourage. But you see, the problem we have in schools in general is that we're sometimes frightened of innovation because we think we're going to get told off. And how do we create more safety around the idea of introducing some of these ideas. And I think that's where we just need to create a more collaborative approach and a sense of oneness around where we all want to fix this together. We can all innovate together. So I think we should be encouraging that ambition for innovation. And yes, technology, absolutely. We talk about it as though it's not part of children's lives. It's a huge part of children's lives. We've just got to, I think, do a better job of working out how we harness it in a school's context without compromising on all the other elements we talked about.
Okay. A question to you, Martin Finn, from Omar Malik. EVERFI is a global company. Are there any countries which you see doing online learning better than others, who have handled the sort of digitization during the pandemic of education better than others?
Yeah, I think it's a really interesting question, because I think one of the interesting things about the pandemic is that schools right across the world have all been affected in exactly the same way. And certainly sort of governments have responded to it in different ways. And I know, for instance, there was a big experiment in Chile where which the government actually incredibly quickly gathered together expert online classes that were then distributed through a very large swathe of schools, and also, you know, in many very deprived circumstances. So I think there are examples in lots of different countries that you can look at, developed and less developed, where the technology has been used. But obviously it also goes back to whether or not children have had access to those devices. And some of the programs that we've had, which were being delivered online in some countries, have no longer been able to be delivered because children just don't have from home the access you know, to the technology. So I'm not sure that I think I know of any country that has singly has sort of handled it brilliantly. But I think there's also, you know, many of these technologies go right across the globe, and that they're available to schools, you know, in any country and in multiple languages. And so again, I'd go back to this point that we've had such an experiment. We must now look at what has actually learned, and how we therefore reimagine the schools. And I think what Adrian was talking about, reimagining that school, and I think some of that is about reimagining how that whole day works. I think it's reimagining how the technology is used at different parts of that day. And also, if we're going to go into extended schools and look at sort of a different sort of tone of learning in some of those spaces, how we can use technology to best effect. Because one thing that is absolutely clear is that young people like technology. They like engaging with it. And I think one thing that we haven't talked about is that we also need to ask children what they want going forward and what they found most useful during this period, and what technology has actually worked for them individually, because I think that that will also determine about how we can use it to best effect going forward.
Right, Robert, we at the Spectator, we had a cover story written by a teacher a few months ago, and she was saying that her problem and experience with online learning was that the kids, when she was in school, she works for a pretty tough comprehensive, the kids that she was least worried about were the ones who filled in their homework quickly and accurately, but the ones, people she was worrying about from day one were the ones she thinks did not a sausage, in her words, during lockdown. They basically weren't engaging, there wasn't anything she could do about it. Now, you spoke about the education gap being wide enough before the pandemic. I put it to you that your government is in no rush to assess the damage done here, that there could be national assessments conducted to find out what sort of pupils have suffered most during lockdown, how far behind they are. But there seems to be a little bit of a see no evil approach from the government and also from the opposition. Both of these parties backed lockdown. Neither of those parties seem to be in a rush to have a stark look at the implications of lockdown and the educational damage. So might you have a bit of a battle on your hands, simply trying to draw attention to the extent of the problems when it comes to the widening of inequalities in the era of remote learning?
Well, this is why I've argued that we need a national long-term plan for education, a recovery plan, because the damage that has been done, particularly to the disadvantage you've highlighted, I highlighted, and many others have highlighted, particularly the children's previous children's commissioner now. I'd also, as I say, I think, I know that they are using consultancies find out about lost learning, but I think there has to be some kind of national assessment for every child to find out exactly how much lost learning there has been, and then you work out what the catch up is needed, and this needs to be done pretty quickly. It should have been done last year, and it should be predominantly to every student. I think that the government need to look in long term about the pupil premium, how that's spent. Should it be more focused for long term disadvantaged pupils rather than just those on free school meals over 6 years, because they dip in and out, some of the families. This is why I'm arguing about the school day as well, because I absolutely believe that some activities should go ahead, and I'm sure brilliant schools are enticing parents in, but the advantage of a long school day is the children are already there. You don't have to drag them in, and I think all those things need to be considered. But the priority of the government should absolutely be, and we should at least acknowledge the 1.7 billion catch-up fund, which is money that didn't exist some months ago. But nevertheless, the priority has to be to reduce the learning gap between disadvantaged pupils and their better off peers. And absolutely right, we have to be very careful about language. I had parents saying to me, very good parents who are campaigning, that they don't like the words catch up and left behind, because they see it as very stigmatizing their kids. So the language and narrative needs to be important. But I'd like the Prime Minister to literally get up in Downing Street and make that speech about a national long-term plan, for us to produce a white paper so that you give education staff stability, and to really have the whole central focus of that plan to be focusing on reducing the attainment gap.
Right. As a matter of interest, but Adrian, quickly ask you this. My mum was a special needs teacher. I mean, every language which you use here, catch up, special needs, hard to reach, it can become stigmatizing. Is there language which you think would make it less so? Because what we're trying to convey is a really important concept, that some children are simply going to need more remedial support than others. I mean, even the word remedial can seem to be pejorative if used in the wrong term. So what should we be doing here to discuss the mission ahead of us?
Well, I think positive. I think Adrian used the word acceleration and moving forward. And we should. I mean, I'm as guilty as anyone of using the terms catch up and left behind. A whole committee is doing an inquiry at the moment into left behind white working class boys and girls who are more disadvantaged than almost any other ethnic group or cohort in education, and do the worst at every stage of our education system. But we need to frame the language. The language is incredibly important. I'm not an expert in that, but in a positive way that doesn't stigmatize, but nevertheless does what it says on the tin and make sure these children get back on that education ladder of opportunity.
Okay, thanks, Rob. Anne Longfield, when you were Children's Commissioner, one of your superpowers, as it were, was that you could ask data from any organisation that you wanted, I think I'm right in saying. I have to say, as a data geek, I would absolutely love to have that power, even for a week, the information I would ask for. But because this is the great mystery now. I mean, we started off this by asking what is the extent of the damage. We don't really know. I'm wondering what information you think needs to come to the fore now, so we can work out what to do next. Because if we're not frank about the nature of the problem, we're not going to be very successful in dealing with that problem. And you will know, perhaps better than most people, what sort of information is available and what is obtainable. I don't know if you can use IT maybe to come up with a nationwide pupil survey to try to get an assessment of this. But what are your thoughts on the questions that need to be asked now?
Yes, well, certainly that was one of the most powerful tools that you have in that role, is you can collect that information. And certainly over the last year, I've really been saying very often to government that they need to be collecting that information. Now, they do collect a lot more information now than they did at the beginning of this pandemic, but it tends to be information about institutions, about schools being open, about schools, school days, all of those things, whereas actually it needs to be about real people's lives. It needs to be about what children, assessments about children's learning. It needs to be about children's mental health. It needs to be about, the number of times children go to A&E. Now, this isn't some kind of big brother you can still do this without names and addresses, but understanding what is going on in children's lives, because one of the big things that doesn't happen, which needs to happen, is that actually across government, the mission of government is to help children actually flourish. And that doesn't happen because each department takes it into its own particular kind of lens and looks at it from their point of view. So I would say, yes, children being back in school, but what's happening to children with special educational needs? Yes, about children's progress and any gap. Apologies for that, but really understanding children's lives. I think the other part of it is when children fall out of school, if children aren't attending, if they are being excluded, because obviously those are bad signs and a sign that something else is needed. I'd also like it to be wider, understanding how many children are living in poverty, because only once you have, and not just the overall numbers, but which children and for what circumstance, because only once you have that data can you start working out not only what to do about it, but modeling scenarios such as recessions before they come along, and be prepared for those situations to hit with the policies that are needed. All of those things, obviously, I'd say are really important, but at the end of the day, it comes down to will. You need to want to do this, and you need to want to make the kind of long-term changes and plan, which we're all saying is absolutely needed.
Thanks. Another question here from Mary Kernick-Cook. Does initial teacher training include learning to teach digitally? Now, unless there are two Mary Kernick-Cooks out there, I doubt it. This is the former head of UCAS. So it's great to have you with us, Mary. I'll throw a question to any panelist. Does initial teacher training include learning how to teach digitally? Good question. Anyone know?
I don't know the answer. Can I just say one thing on teacher recruitment? We know that 2/3 of new teachers leave the profession after 5 years, and part of a recovery plan or long-term plan should be about transforming teacher recruitment, incentivizing teachers to work in disadvantaged areas, perhaps setting up local teacher training agencies or recruitment colleges in those areas to get good leadership, good teachers where the schools need it most.
Right. Well, I'll give you something to cheer you up, Robert. The Spectator recently tried to hire a teacher. She's one of our former interns, but she wouldn't join us because she was loving teaching too much. So that's good news. It's probably, I had mixed feelings in that. I felt sad as a potential employer, but happy for society that women of her caliber are staying, to be honest, where they can do the most benefit. But
training on teacher training, of course, it comes back to this point that this isn't new to teaching, the idea of using technology. So there is always a focus on the potential of blended learning, for example, where we use technology to support learning before and after a lesson. So yes, it's been part of what we do for some time. It's not new. It's changed because we've used it in a way which is teaching online. I don't think anyone wants to make that a habit. So right. I'd hope we don't have modules on how to teach on Teams, because it's basically never as good as really teaching in a classroom. So let's just ditch it.
Yeah. Well, Adrian, I have to say, I share your will that this would never happen again. But I have to say that when the first lockdown happened, I thought that to myself as well. I thought, now we've seen the huge harm this poses in society, it's not going to happen again. But it did, not twice. I don't know, once, but twice again. And Martin, perhaps I'd like to throw that question to you, because during the pandemic, a lot of teachers were plunged into a position of using tech that they'd probably never seen before. Now, you would have got some of the private schools who probably had a lot more resource to put into training the teachers on how to do this. A lot of the lesser resourced state schools will have really struggled. So do you think this is an issue? Because if there is, it's not impossible to foresee not necessarily another pandemic, but school closures for other reasons. Now that this is a tool in policymakers' toolkit, I would be amazed if this never happens again in my lifetime. I'd be amazed if it doesn't happen again sometime in the next 5 years. So do you think it's time, Martin, that more was done to teach teachers how to use tech properly when needs be?
I think it's incredibly important to teach them, because if you look back over the history of technology in education in the last, I'd say, sort of 30 years, you can always find schools that are doing extraordinary things with technology. And there are fantastic examples, and there have been fantastic programs, and there's been the evidence there about the effectiveness of them. But that hasn't been universal. And a lot of schools have fallen way, way behind. And also that the training for teachers has been so sporadic, and it's on an individual school basis, and it's whether or very often just whether or not money was left available in order to train teachers. And I think going forward, especially, you know, after everything that we've been through and this experimentation with technology, and also I think with that increase in confidence of teachers, because that was so often the problem, that teachers just don't feel confident about teaching it, that we need, as part of that wider plan that I think we absolutely need, to think about how do we train teachers to use that technology, and also to make recommendations about what technology works. Because, you know, if you look at sort of some of the programs that we have, you get data out of the back end that's not just for the teacher. You can gather that because it's all available on the platform, and you can show whether or not it's actually delivered the learning outcomes that you wanted. Now, if that evidence is available for those programs, then they ought to be made available to all schools to say, look, this has been in some way, you know, there is evidence that this works, and ensure that the teachers are equipped to actually use that. So absolutely, I think we need a huge training program for all teachers around this, for where it's needed.
Well, technology has made today's events possible. So I'd like to thank you for the gods of Zoom for making this possible. Thank you for our audience for joining us. And most of all, thank you to our incredible panel, Martin and Adrian and Robert. So if you'd like to ask any questions, or here's the thing, the question's gone, but if there's anything you'd like to follow up on, anything you think the Spectator should be writing about, raised from this discussion, then please do send an email to events@spectator.co.uk. We're going to be writing lots about this in the coming weeks and months, and I think it's all the more important that these discussions happen outside Parliament, because I don't think nearly enough is being said inside of Parliament on this hugely important topic. And again, I'd like to thank EVERFI for making this debate possible. So thanks for watching, thanks to our guests, and I would say join us next time. I'm not quite sure when we'll have another one of these, but I hope soon, because there is so much to learn, and perhaps we'll get that optimistic outcome that Adrian mentioned in his opening remarks. Thank you.